Right, what's up, everybody? My name is Will Berkman, and today I'm going to talk you through the biomechanical principles of powerlifting training. Before we start with content, I always think it's good to just set some goals for a lecture. So by the end of today, I want you to understand basic biomechanical principles. So that means I want you to know what things like force, torque, or moment is, what moment arms are, and then be able to relate those concepts to lifting weights. I also want you to be able to identify the major joint torques in the power lifts and deduce which muscles will contribute to successful performance of the movements. Then I want you to be able to relate errors of lifting execution to the force-producing demands of the lifts and infer which muscles or joints will be more or less taxed as a result of those deviations in movement that we're talking about. Now, biomechanics can be a little bit dense, so if you guys don't have any backing in biomechanics or you're finding what I'm saying to be a little bit difficult to follow, that's all very normal. And what I'd encourage you to do is to pause me as often as you have to. And whether or not you're finding what I'm saying hard to follow, I'd encourage you to do this too. Pause me and stand up and actually move through some of the lifts that we're talking about, move through some of the motions that I described, and see if what you feel gels with what I'm saying. Because the more you can relate the things I'm saying to your own experiences and what you've observed and felt, the easier it's going to be both to understand and remember it. For those of you who sit on the other end of the spectrum and find what I'm saying pretty digestible but want to learn a whole lot more, there is further reading included in a whole number of these slides. So I'd go explore that. But the other place that I'd point you is where a lot of this further reading actually points you itself, and that's to the writings of Greg Nuckols. So I have to give a massive acknowledgement to Greg. Here's How to Squat, Bench, and Deadlift comprehensive guides on his website, Stronger by Science, are excellent. They're really good resources. So if you want to hear some of the things I've said reiterated with fresh diagrams and a new perspective, I'd check that out. If you want to go on them and see some more detail about the actual functional anatomy, so see which muscles are involved, exactly what their functions are, where they attach, and things like that, all of that is included in those guides as well. They're a terrific resource if you want to learn more. But he's also written some more advanced articles that go into concepts about, say, bar path of the bench press and things like that. So really, really good places to start if you want to learn a little bit more. Finally, I have to acknowledge one of my colleagues at Lift Performance Center, Clint Hill, who ran over this lecture with me, and Clint's master's is in biomechanics. So it was a very helpful discussion, just helped me make sure that I was giving you guys the best information that I could. So with that out of the way, like I said, remember to pause me, stand up, try the things I'm saying as often as you need to. But for the moment, we're going to start talking about some basic biomechanical terms, and then from there we can go and add some color and talk about the weights, or the lifts, I should say. All right, so the first concept that we're going to talk about is force. Most of you are probably familiar with the equation F equals ma, and in long form, all that means is force equals mass times acceleration. Forces are linear, which is to say that they act in straight lines, right, such as straight down. And we calculate forces in newtons. That's written with a capital N. And for our purposes, or most pertinently when we're lifting weights, anytime we raise a given mass, if unresisted, it's going to accelerate towards the center of the earth at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? And so if you have a look at figure 1, what you've got is a 100 kilogram barbell that we're just presuming is suspended in the air. With gravity acting upon it, it wants to accelerate downwards at 9.8 meters per second squared. Now, because force is mass times acceleration, like I just said, you can times that mass, 100 kilograms, by the acceleration, 9.8 meters per second squared, and you get the figure in newtons, which is 980 newtons of downward acting force, right? Now, in order to lift that bar, what we would need to do is apply force to it in an upward direction of greater than 980 newtons. If we just applied 980 newtons exactly, the bar would be held still, right? Because the sum of the forces is 0. More than 980 newtons, as I said, would begin to raise it, and less than 980 newtons would lower it. So when we think about lifting weights more generally, what it requires us to do is to produce sufficient force to move the object in the direction that we want to, at the speed that we want to. And for our purposes, we can basically consider that to be us moving against gravity. Now, the second concept we're going to talk about is that of moment. That's what it says behind my head here. And moment is just force applied about an axis. So how we calculate moments sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but in reality it's not so bad, and you'll see that as we do an example on the left shortly. So the way we calculate it, though, is we multiply forces by the distance from the axis that they are applied, perpendicular to the direction that the force is acting. And the important thing to remember about moments as opposed to forces is that they're rotational. Now, to see how they work and hopefully make a bit more sense of that definition that I just gave you, let's have a look at figure 2. So what you've got is this fella standing here at the top of the lateral raise, right? And presume he's holding a 10 kilogram dumbbell in his hand. So we've got 10 kilograms here, gravity's acting upon it. This 10 kilograms wants to accelerate towards the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared because of gravity, which means there's 98 newtons of downward acting force, right? But this guy's arm doesn't just fly off at the shoulder and drop onto the floor, right? Instead, it moves within the shoulder joint, within the glenohumeral joint, and adducts towards the body. So this arm swings in towards the midline. And that driver to adduct, or that driver to rotate within the joint, is moment. It's what we're describing here. Now, for the sake of maths, I've said that this fellow's arm is 1 meter long. That's a reasonably long arm. So if we've got 98 newtons of downward acting force, remembering that moment is force times distance, 98 newtons times 1 meter gives us 98 newton meters of moment at the joint. Now, if this arm was only half as long, so if it was 0.5 meters instead of 1, we'd have 49 newton meters of moment acting at that joint. And that's in spite of the fact that the downward acting force is the same, right? There's still 98 newtons of downward acting force, but this distance changing changes the amount of moment that's experienced. And expanding on that, that's part of why bending your elbows excessively during a lateral raise would be considered cheating, because it reduces the force-producing demands at the shoulder, right? Related to that exact same concept as well is that as the mass moves around the axis, the moment that it exerts changes. So let's have a look at the figure on the right now. This guy's arm is now sitting directly under the shoulder joints. There's no distance between the axis of rotation and where the force is applied. So we've got 98 newtons of downward acting force. We've got no perpendicular distance between the axis of rotation and that force, and so there's still 0 newton meters of moment at this joint because we've got 98 times 0. Were we to raise this guy's arm out to the side a little bit, there would be some tendency to rotate. There's no tendency to rotate now. So lift the arm out a little bit, there's some tendency to rotate, so there's some moment experienced, but the moment is maximized when your arms are held directly out to your body here because the perpendicular distance to the direction that the force is applied or that the force is acting is maximized. And if you still can't wrap your head around that one, then another nice way to consider it is thinking about how you carry shopping bags. So when you go shopping, almost certainly you don't walk around with your arms out to the sides like so, iron cross style. Instead, you probably hold your arms as close to your sides as you can while you're walking. And part of the reason that you do that is because it's effort conserving or energy conserving. It's much easier to carry the shopping bags as close to underneath your shoulder joint as you possibly can, right? Now, I might have already said moment and torque interchangeably. I can't recall. There is a semantic difference between the two of them, but for our purposes, we can more or less just consider them the same thing. So when a force acts about an axis, it exerts a moment or a torque. And from here on in, if I say either, it doesn't matter. They mean the same thing. Now, the final concept we're going to cover is that of a moment arm. That's what it says behind my head here. And I've already begun explaining what a moment arm is by explaining how important it is that the arm stays straight during the lateral raise. But what a moment arm is just simply the length between the axis of rotation and where the force is applied, acting about that axis, right? So again, we've spoken about arm distance in the lateral raise. Another really good example to consider is that of the hammer. So if we consider the head of the hammer to be holding most of its weight, right? When we hold a hammer by the handle, if we hold it right out at the end of the handle, the head feels very heavy. And as you slide your hand further and further down the shaft towards the head, it feels lighter and lighter and lighter. And that discrepancy in what you're feeling is described almost entirely just by the change in moment arm, right? So here we've got this very long moment arm to work against. Put your hand all the way down here, the moment arm's much shorter and the head feels much shorter as a result. And that's why when you're just tapping in nails that have been mostly hammered in all the way already, you usually hold somewhere down here on the hammer handle just because you're only having to tap and you want to have fine control as opposed to having to really swing the hammer very hard. So now that that stuff's all out of the way, let's tie it into muscles and weights. So when we lift weights, the mass of the objects that we lift exerts a downward force upon us due to gravity acting upon them. And our body is essentially a complicated series of levers, that's what our bones are, with axes, they're our joints, about which rotation is possible. Our muscles attach to our bones and contract in a linear fashion, and they produce moments of their own. So the moment arm for our muscles, I should say, is just the distance between their attachment and the center of the joint that they're moving, right? We call the moments that our muscles produce internal moments, whereas moments that weights or external forces acting upon our body produce are called external moments. And although gravity is acting downwards when we lift weights, what that sums up to is a whole bunch of different rotational forces acting on our joints. And when our muscles produce sufficient force for us to overcome the moment that the weight produces, we get the desired joint motion. When they don't, then we don't. So in order for us to lift a weight successfully, basically what we have to do is have the sum of the moment or torques that our muscles produce exceed the sum of the moment or torques that the weights acting downwards upon us produce. Again, we'll take a super fast example, and that'll hopefully make a little bit more sense. And we're going to use the most important lift of all, the bicep curl. So in the case of the bicep curl, the internal moment arm is the distance between where the bicep attaches on the forearm and the center of the elbow joint. The external moment arm is the distance between the center of mass of the forearm, which we're just going to assume for now is the dumbbell, and the elbow. And if we add some figurative numbers to that, we can actually see how it all maths out. So let's do that now. Okay. Just for the sake of maths, I'm going to say everything in terms of meters, but you'll see on the diagram things are written in terms of centimeters. Again, because we talk in Newton meters, it's just easier if I use meters myself. Okay. So if we imagine a bicep that attaches 0.1 meters from the center of the joint on a forearm that is 0.5 meters long, and the weight weighs 1 kilogram, and the forearm is parallel to the floor, and the reason being parallel to the floor is important is because that means the perpendicular distance to a downward acting force is just exactly the length of the forearm. If we assume all of those things, we can do some very simple maths and see how much force is required to be produced by our bicep. So first things first, we've got a 1 kilogram weight. It wants to accelerate downwards at 9.8 meters per second squared due to gravity. So there's 9.8 newtons of downward acting force. So everybody should be able to follow step one. 1 kilogram weight wants to go down 9.8 newtons of force. Now that's causing rotation about the elbow joint, and the moment arm is the length of the forearm, which is 0.5 meters. So we have 9.8, we times it by 0.5, we get 4.9 Newton meters of moment. But this big word here, extensor, is there because of this. This moment is wanting to move our elbow into elbow extension, right? It's wanting to have our arm drop down and open this space up. So we would describe this as an extensor moment or an extensor torque. Now the bicep has to produce an equivalent amount of torque in the opposite direction, so 4.9 Newton meters of flexor moment or flexor torque to prevent us dropping the curl from this position. And we can actually reverse engineer exactly how much force is required to be produced really quickly and easily here. So because the moment arm of the bicep is 0.1 meters, and we know how much torque it needs to produce, we can just divide that, so 4.9 by the moment arm, 0.1, and we get 49 newtons of force that the bicep needs to contract with. Hopefully all of you can follow that. Take a pause, see if you can work it out for yourself if you don't, but the bicep needs to contract with 49 newtons of force here. Now, if the bicep were to contract with more force than that, so 50 newtons of force, we'd begin to move into flexion. If the bicep contracted with 500 newtons of force, we'd begin to move into flexion very, very quickly. And if it only produced 48 newtons of force, we'd begin to lower the weight very slowly. Because force is mass times acceleration, with us just assuming that only gravity is acting upon us at the time, we could actually calculate exactly how quickly we would begin to move very easily from this point. But for now, that's not really important. What is important is that you have this sort of conceptual understanding that the weight is wanting to move our joint in one direction, and our muscle has to produce sufficient force to overcome this tendency to move in that direction and move us in the desired joint direction instead. Now, there's a few things that we haven't considered. I've just spoken about how speed of movement relates to the amount of force applied. So if we apply much more force in the direction that we want, the weight's going to move faster. The other thing is that we're doing this as a snapshot of the bicep curl. So if we were to change positions a little bit, so say straightening the elbow, the moment around the joint changes. Remember how I said that it was important that the forearm was parallel to the floor. So if we change the position of the forearm a little bit, the moment around the joint changes, and so would the force-producing demands on our bicep. And that helps illustrate part of why sticking points occur in lifts, right? The force required of your muscles is not uniform across your range of motions. It peaks in certain parts. And if you all stand up again now and do some fake bicep curls, you can probably, in your mind, imagine where you really, really start to grind your bicep curls when you do a set that's very difficult, right? The other thing that we haven't considered is that muscles have physiological properties themselves that impact their force-producing abilities. So muscles aren't capable of producing the exact same forces across their whole range of motion, and they tend to be strongest at close to their resting length. You also have non-contractile elements of your muscles and of other connective tissues that can aid in producing force at certain points of the range of motion, depending on how you're moving. So your capacity to actually produce force is also not the same at every joint position. In the case of biarticular muscles, so a good example is the hamstrings. The hamstring is a knee flexor and a hip extensor. So it can bend your foot towards your bum and it can bring your hips through and forward, right? The position of one joint can impact the ability of the muscle to produce force at the other joint as well. So remembering that I just said that muscles are strongest at close to their resting length, if you have a muscle that you can lengthen and shorten at two joints, if you lengthen or shorten it at one joint, where it is relative to resting length at the joint position, at a given joint position, at the other joint will change. And that's why seated and lying hamstring curls probably feel different for you at different points of the range of motion. When we look at the bicep curl specifically as well, you can move your arm just above or just below parallel and create equivalent joint moments in either positions. But most of you would probably rather hold the bicep curl in one position than the other. And that's largely because the muscle is more advantaged in that position. So again, I'd encourage you to stand up and mimic those motions and try it out. So what that means in sum is that joint moments don't really tell us everything that we need to know about lifting weights, but they're a very good place to start. So we use joint moments to give us some idea of what the strains on our body are going to be, what muscles are likely to be taxed in a movement at a given time, and give us some insight into the forces at play and where they might peak. But you have to remember that there are other considerations before you necessarily just use biomechanics as the basis of all of your decisions. So at this point, you should have a conceptual understanding that our weights exert a downward force, or weights acting upon us exert a downward force on us due to gravity acting upon them. And our limbs and our joints allow for that downward force to become rotational forces about each of our joints. Our muscles then act to produce the force required to lift or lower weights. And if they can't produce sufficient force to produce the desired joint action, then we fail lifts. And where your levers are longer or weights are heavier, the force-producing demands on your muscles also increase. Now, before I move on to the squat, guys, that might have been a little bit to digest, so if you need it, have a little break. I myself am going to have a pause and get a drink, then we're going to come right back to it. Hoo-wee. All right. I was getting very hoarse at that point. So let's move on to the squat, which is the first lift we're going to talk about. And what I want you to do is have a look at figure 6 here and look at where the barbell is sitting on us and deduce what the main moments are being created by the weight. So what tendencies is this downward acting force going to produce in our body? And then what are the muscles that produce movements opposing those moments? So what muscles are going to need to fire to take us from this position back to a standing position? Pause me if you have to, guys. If not, I'm just going to jump right ahead. And tell you the answers. So, the main ones you should have identified are a hip flexor moment and a knee flexor moment. So, hip flexor moment meaning that your torso wants to move down towards your thigh, and a knee flexor moment meaning that your thigh wants to move down towards your shank here. But the more astute among you have probably also noticed a spine flexor moment and an ankle dorsiflexor moment. So your spine wants to crumple over a little bit here, and if you presume your foot to be flat instead of this wedge shape, then there's a little space here that also wants to close off. So your shin wants to move down towards the top of your foot. Now, that means that the movements that we need to be successful moving from here back into a standing position are hip extension. So our hip extensors are our gluteus maximus, your hamstrings and your adductors. Knee extension, so our quadriceps need to do work. We need back extension to prevent us crumbling over, so that's your erector spinae. And our plantar flexors, so your calf muscles being your soleus and gastrocnemius, need to also fire to prevent you moving into dorsiflexion too much. Now, you'll notice that hamstrings have a little question mark against them. So about hip extension and the squat. There's a 2019 study, it's in the further reading down here, by Kubo et al. And what they found after full depth squatting was there were significant increases in quad, glute, and adductor muscle volumes, but there was no significant increase in hamstring volume. And if you read the articles by Greg Knuckles down here, there's a bit of a detailed look at the evidence for why hamstrings probably play a minor role in squat performance. So the first thing to consider is that the hamstrings are a hip extensor, right? So they do help us with this desired joint action, moving the hip through towards the midline. However, they're also a knee flexor, and remembering that the desired joint action is knee extension, there's a cost in using the hamstrings for hip extension in the squat. Although the hamstring actually attaches a little bit further from the hip than it does from the knee. So that means when the hamstring contracts with a given amount of force, there is a little bit more hip extension produced than there is knee flexion. So it is a net benefit, but with some cost when you use it. Now, the exact same thing is true, but in reverse of one of your quadriceps muscles. So your rectus femoris is a hip flexor and a knee extensor. And what these two muscles end up doing in concert instead is working as force transducing mechanisms. So when you extend the hips, right, you pull on your rectus femoris, remembering that it's a hip flexor, which helps begin to extend the knee. Likewise, when you extend the knee, you pull on your hamstrings because your hamstring is a knee flexor. You pull on the hamstrings, which helps you with extending the hip. So your knees and hips become an interconnected system when you squat. They both help each other out, and the thing that transfers force between them are the hamstrings and the rectus femoris. And that's one reason why when people do studies on muscle activation in squatting, it doesn't change as much in more or less upright squatting positions as you would expect because of those muscles playing that force transducing role. Squatting as a skill basically involves keeping the combined system center of mass within your base of support, right? So that's basically your feet. But when you are squatting a weight that is very light relative to your body weight, because you displace your butt and hips backwards and they weigh something, you expect to see a little bit more forward translation of the bar. So in figure 6 here, we've got the bar sitting directly over the middle of the foot. And in the case of a very, very heavy weight, you can more or less expect that to happen, right? Because that is the center of mass of the system. But where this is only 20 or 30 or 40 kilos, you might expect some more forward translation during the descent and backwards translation during the ascent just to keep you balanced. And that can be fine and normal as well. What we're looking for, though, is balance across the foot, staying even the whole time. Now, from this bottom position, we need to produce sufficient knee and hip extension to move the bar back up into the standing position. And I've already begun to talk about how those two systems work together. But the demands between the two are also coupled. So if we have a look at figure 7 here, were we to presume that both femurs are parallel to the ground, then you can see that any shift into more or less knee flexion or hip flexion is coupled with a concomitant increase or reduction at the other joint as well. Which is to say that let's go here. So say this fella shoved his knees way forward, right? This moment arm, X centimeters, would increase. But this moment arm, Y centimeters, would decrease in exactly proportional amount. So we can move from this position into this position, loading the hips more and loading the knees less. And that's exactly what can happen in the case of people who do a good morning squat or a stripper squat, as some people call it, right? If somebody has insufficient quad strength, they might get to the bottom of the hole and say, I can't produce sufficient knee extension torque to get me out of this bottom position. Instead, the knees shove back towards the midline, and the hip shoves back, so you fall into more hip flexion. You load the hip extensors more, and the knee extensors less. Your quads are suddenly within their happy range of force production, but your hip extensors have to pick up the slack. So that's one reason why you might see a good morning or a stripper style squat. There are also other technical reasons, right? So you can't necessarily just attribute it to poor quad strength, but it's certainly a tendency that does emerge for people with weaker quads, and it's something that happens to me myself at heavier loads. Now, as these two extend, though, we need to keep our spine relatively stiff, or else we fail to transfer the force that we're putting into the floor into the bar, and we just crumple over like an accordion. And that's where spinal extension demands of the squat kick in. So let's talk about that a little bit now. So the spine's actually made up of a whole bunch of different segments, right? It's not just, your spine isn't one piece of bone, it's a whole series of bones up along it. And the moment that the weight exerts about the spine is essentially just its horizontal distance from a given segment. If you can imagine that, it's also why bending over more when you squat puts more strain on your spine. And it's also why when we move the bar higher up our back, we put more strain on our spine as well. So let's have a look at this. So we've got, you can ignore this dotted line, by the way. It's not important. So in the case of this person doing a low bar squat, we've got, we've got this distance from the waist here. The lumbar spine's loaded. The thoracic spine's not very loaded. As we move further up the back, the moment arm increases for both of them, and it increases proportionally more for the thoracic spine. And then if we move the bar into a front squat position, same thing happens. Both cop an increase in extension demands, but the increase is proportionally greater for the upper back. And that's very important, right? Now, this difference is mitigated a little bit in reality by the fact that most people squat more upright in a high bar squat position or a front squat position. So you don't see this exact proportional increase in back extension demands. However, what you do see is people being punished much, much more for postural deviations in the high bar squat and the front squat than they do in the low bar squat. And what I mean is this. Let's go back to our knee extension example. So this person's quads can't do the job, right? So instead, they shove their butt back. So they load the quads a little bit less. So remember, this moment arm has reduced. They shove the butt back. They load the quads a little bit less. They load the hips more instead, and they fold over. So here, back extension demands have increased, right? Let's zoom ahead to here. So in the case of a low bar squat, back extension demands increase. The upper back cops a little bit more stress. The lower back cops a little bit more stress, but you can probably grind through it. Now, those of you who've done a very hard high bar or front squat know that that's not the case. And the reason is when your quads can't do the job here and your butt shoves back, the strain on your upper back is very high on a high bar squat. And on a front squat, it's unbelievably high, and that's probably exacerbated a little bit by the fact that you're holding the bar like so and can just drop it forwards. So your upper back gets absolutely torched for postural deviations in either of these squats, right? So in short, for a given bar position, we can just say that having a more inclined torso means more extension torque is required from the back. And when your hips shift back per the above, you are disproportionately punished the further up your back the bar is placed. And that's one reason why people usually find low bar squatting a little bit easier. And again, Greg Knuckles has written terrifically good articles explaining exactly that. I'd very strongly advise you to check them out, I should say. Now, I've already mentioned the changes to back strain associated with high bar and front squats as opposed to the low bar squat. What about the safety squat or the safety bar squat? So this study under further reading there by Hecker et al. Looked at lower body mechanics during a back squat and a safety bar squat. And in this one, they found that the trunk was less inclined and the hips less flexed for a given amount of knee flexion in the safety bar squat than a back squat or than a normal back squat. And that's because the safety bar distributes the center of mass of the weights forward a little bit. So you can be balanced in a slightly more upright position than a normal squat. That also explains why in the case of safety bar squats, if you do shift load, like I described back here, from the quads to the hips, you are disproportionately punished, right? So you must stay in your quads to do an effective safety bar squat, or else your upper back gets absolutely torched. It's just like a front squat. And we can use this exact same logic to examine why front squats are usually more taxing on the quads than on the hips as compared to other squats, right? In order to keep us in the upright torso position needed to stop our upper back getting absolutely roasted in a front squat, we shove our knees forward a very long way. And if your quads can't do the work to get you out of the hole here and your butt shoves back, then you drop the bar forwards, okay? So hopefully that's all making sense. Basically, deviations down here from a lack of quad strength punish us up here for in our upper back, right? And if your quads can't do the work to support you, then your back has to pick up some of the slack when we move it into our hips. Now, what haven't we discussed in the case of squatting? The main thing is the calves. And for now, I don't think we really need to. And that's because the way we increase plantar flexion demands when we squat is by shoving the knees forward. So again, in the case of the front squat here, the knees are shoved way forward. So you can imagine that this plantar flexion or dorsiflexion moment is really high, right? But high plantar flexion demands are pretty much always going to be coupled with high quad demands. And in my experience, nobody's been limited by calf strength in their squats that I've ever worked with, and calf training's only ever really been necessary from like a mobility point of view. So to make sure that you do have the dorsiflexion range to get you into a comfortable, good squatting position. You can't increase calf demands without increasing quad demands, and your quads are usually going to be the first failure point when you squat. So in my experience, calf training, not that important. Probably don't need to worry about the calves too much. The other thing that we haven't really considered is movement outside of the sagittal plane. But were you to use the same processes that we've just done here, you could assess forces in the other planes too. And for a complete understanding of movement, it's probably important that you do so. Many of the muscles that are really important for us to squat do act in multiple planes. So the glutes, for instance, both extend and externally rotate the hip, while the adductors, which are an important hip extensor from the bottom of the squat, also move your thighs in towards the midline. So you do need to be able to consider the way in which those planes are interrelated. Now, just like I said at the end of the introductory section, I'd encourage you guys to pause me now if you need to, take yourself off for a quick break, and then just recap some of the things that we've covered. So if you haven't already had the chance, get up and move through some of the positions and motions that I've spoken about. Make sure that it's all gelling with you, and then in a moment we're going to move on to the bench press. For the meantime, though, I'm going to have a pause myself and have a drink. Oh, there you go. Alrighty, guys, we're back, and now we are going to talk about the bench press. So what we're going to do initially is just the exact same exercise as what we did with the squat. So I want you to take a look at figure 11 here and just note what the main moments are being created by the weight. Then I also want you to note what the main muscles are that would produce movements opposing those moments. So pause me if you have to, otherwise I'm going to carry straight on. So bench is conceptually the same as the squat. It is a little bit more complicated though. From the side, you can see how the bar produces an extensor moment at the shoulder. And from above, you can see how it produces an abduction moment at the shoulder, and possibly also see it producing a flexor moment at the biceps, just depending on the grip width. This means that the primary muscles involved in bench pressing are your shoulder flexors, so your anterior deltoids, your pectoralis major, your shoulder adductors, so muscles that bring the bar in towards your midline, and that's chiefly your pectoralis major, and also your elbow extensors, being your triceps. Now, note that while we might consider some other muscles to do these joint actions, most of them don't play much of an active role in the bench press. So the long head of the biceps brachii is a shoulder flexor, but it's a much better elbow flexor than it is shoulder flexor. So it's probably not heavily involved there. And likewise, the lat is an adductor of the shoulder. So the lat, the latissimus dorsi, brings your arm across your midline, but it's also a very powerful shoulder extensor, which is the opposite of one of the main joint actions that we want to achieve in the bench press. And so it's also not playing a primary role very likely in movement. However, those muscles do play a very important part in stabilizing the joint, the shoulder joint, for us to bench press effectively. And likewise, the long head of the triceps brachii is an elbow extensor, is a shoulder extensor, but it's a much better elbow extensor. And so if it's doing anything as far as shoulder extension goes, it's probably just playing a stabilizing role. For the most part, we think about bench press as being about our anterior delts, our pec major, and our triceps, and other things just help stabilize us. Now, similarly to when we squat, when we bench press, this says muscles behind my head. When we bench press, the distance from the bar to the shoulder when it's on our chest determines shoulder flexion demands. And the distance between our hands, so our grip width, essentially determines how much adduction force is required, so how much pec strain there is. With narrower grips, we tend to touch lower on the torso, meaning there's also more flexion and front delt involvement. And if you touch with your elbows towards your feet, that creates a flexor moment at the elbow, which increases triceps demands again. And if your hands are inside your elbows, that also massively increases triceps demands. So if you have a look at figure 12 here, you can see, and sorry guys, this is a typo, this should say wide grip, this should say narrow grip. In the instance of the narrow grip bench presser, we've got them touching further down the torso, so the distance from the bar to the shoulder is greater, so there's more flexion demand, right? And the distance from your hands to your midline is lesser, so there's less adduction demand. Likewise, in the wide grip example, touching less far down the torso, so there's less flexion demand, more adduction demand. Now, as far as triceps go in the bench press, again, I'm going to punt to Greg Knuckles. Triceps can be a little bit confusing. So I'd very strongly recommend checking out the part about triceps in his How to Bench article here. It's terrific. He's got some really good diagrams that explain it. But one way to think about triceps in the bench is that because the bar is a fixed object and your grip doesn't slide on it, any extension of the elbow is going to lead to adduction of the humerus. So guys, you can do this for yourself. I'm going to stand here like so with my arms. Actually, I'll do it this close apart. So the only way that I can extend my elbows without my hands moving apart from each other is also to bring my arm in towards the midline, right? Is to adduct at the shoulder. Likewise, if I were to set my arms in an air bench position here and adduct at the shoulder, so just bring my arm across the midline, the only way I could do it without moving my hands closer together is to also extend at the elbow, right? So your pecs and triceps can work together when you're bench pressing in that respect. Now, even when your elbows are inside your hands when you touch on the chest, so you take a very, very wide grip and you tuck your elbows into your sides a little bit, the bar, you would think the bar is producing an extensor moment, right? It's trying to make your elbow straighten. Your triceps pushing your hands outwards against the bar means that they're heavily involved. They extend outwards and change the vector of the force acting downwards such that they do have a moment arm against which to work. It's just a little bit less than they would were your grip a bit narrower. And again, I think that's explained really well in Greg's article, so strongly suggest that you check it out. Now, bar path can also influence net force producing demands at different positions during the rep when you're bench pressing. There's another really good article, again by Greg, that I strongly suggest you read. That's the second one of these points here. But suffice to say that when you've touched on the chest, your bar path should move back towards your face early in the press. And the reason is, as you get towards the midpoint of the bench press, where most people begin to stall, it reduces shoulder flexion demands. So again, that extensor moment here is reduced when the bar moves back towards your face rapidly. So if you begin to stick and you haven't moved the bar back towards your face, this extensor moment, so that means the flexion demands are higher and it's harder to grind through that portion, right? Check out this article. It's got some great diagrams and some research supporting exactly that point. But if you press too straight, then you're going to find your sticking point harder. What I'd like to do, though, is talk about what happens in practice when we bench with a wide grip and an arch as opposed to a flat back and a narrower grip. So without going into shoulder position and stability and so on, the first benefit of benching with an arch is just that it reduces the range of motion. So it reduces the distance that the bar has to move, right? And a second effect is a reduction in shoulder flexion demands when we actually touch on the chest. So if we have a look in figure 13 here, in both examples, you can note that the horizontal distance between the shoulder and the bar on the chest in both examples. So remembering moment arms, the downward force that the bar's enacting upon us is going to, or the downward force of the bar is going to enact a greater shoulder flexion moment on, or shoulder extension moment on this fella than it does on this guy, simply because the horizontal distance is greater for him than it is from him from the shoulder, right? And this is despite the fact that in both instances, he's actually touching on the exact same point of the torso. So you've got the exact same length of sternum in both of these guys, and he's touching right on the end of it. Now, because we're able to touch in the same place on the torso with less displacement down the torso in an arch position, people with a big arch would be expected mostly to bench with a straighter bar path on the descent and ascent than people with a flat back. In the case of the flat back bencher, you really should see that pronounced early kick back towards the face for a successful heavy press, right? And finally, we would expect that the wider gripped higher arch bencher would have more pec demand than the flatter backed narrower grip bench presser, as the amount of abduction at the shoulder is going to be greater with a wide grip than it will with a narrow grip. Okay, again, everybody should take a moment to pause. If you need to go and act out some of the things I've spoken about, then I'd strongly encourage you to. Otherwise, just take a very quick break, recap what we've covered, and then I'm going to come back in 1 second to talk about the deadlift. Okay, I'm back. Presumably you've had a break. If you haven't, that's great. Let's soldier on anyway. And the final lift for us to discuss today is the deadlift. So we're going to do the exact same exercise as what we did with the squat and the bench press. Take a look at figure 14 here. I want you to identify the main moments that are going to be created by the weight. I want you to then identify what the muscles are that produce movements opposing those moments. Pause me if you need to. Otherwise, 3, 2, 1. The main moments you should have identified are a spinal flexor moment, so the bar wants to bend your spine over. A hip flexor moment, so it wants to close this distance between the spine and the thigh. A knee flexor moment, so it wants to close the distance between the thigh and the calf or the shank. And possibly the astute among you have also noticed a spine flexor moment. Not spine flexor, shoulder flexor moment. So without just a little bit of shoulder extension work, so pulling the humerus in towards the torso here, the bar will want to drift out and away from your body. And that essentially describes the role of the lats or the latissimus dorsi in deadlifting. So the main muscles involved then are your spine extensors, your erector spinae, your hip extensors being your hamstrings and glute max in this instance, and your knee extensors, your quadriceps, as well as the lats. So first things first, we'll talk about spinal extension demands when we deadlift. So it says reducing spinal extension demands, question mark. So spinal flexor demands in the deadlift are affected by how long and how inclined your torso is. And given that we can't change how long your torso is, your inclination, that was a pun, your inclination might be to try to force yourself into a more upright position to change spinal extension demands. But unfortunately, if you do that, then we run into some logistical problems. So if you shove your knees forward, having a look at figure 15, shove your knees way too far forward and try and squat the bar up, then eventually the bar has to pass your shin. And because the bar is a straight line and it's not impermeable, it is impermeable, the only way it can do so is for the bar to either swing way away from your body, which increases back extension demands again anyway, or to have you shoot your hips back and fall over the bar again, which basically places you in the high hipped position you otherwise would have been and increases back extension demands again back to where, again, they otherwise would have been. Only in this case, you weren't tight in that position, right? Now, if you tried to just lean way back and sit back against the bar like this fella, the same rebalancing would have to occur in the end to actually get the bar off the floor. But in the meantime, you'd have massively increased the thoracic extensor work that you have to do. Only this time you haven't really placed yourself in a position that your legs can actually help you off the floor. So in short, there's not a whole lot that you can really do to reduce spinal extension demands at the floor level when you deadlift. There was a recent study, this is the one in further reading that you can look at there, that showed that if you change your starting position a little bit in the deadlift, you might change your ability to produce the force required to lift the bar. So they had people either set up in more of a clean pull style deadlift, so slightly lower hips, knees slightly further forward, or in the higher hipped, more powerlifting-esque deadlift. And while the force producing demands weren't changed in either position, for certain subjects, one position or the other was more favorable. So certainly you can play with your start position a little bit to help get the bar off the floor. But once the bar is off the floor, you essentially just have to deal with the hand that you're dealt and keep lifting the bar, okay? So the one way that we can reduce extension demands a little bit, though, is to actually round the back itself. So rounding the back does shorten the spine, really. And it also brings your hips higher and a little bit closer to the bar, which reduces hip extension demands. Unfortunately, though, you do have to re-extend the spine eventually, and many people find themselves unable to produce much force or get very stable if they're in a very, very rounded position. The important conceptual lesson here, though, is that rounding the back in the deadlift can occur even with good technique at heavy weights. And it can occur both because the back itself isn't strong enough to support you in a position of extension, or because your hips aren't strong enough to produce sufficient hip extension force from that distance from the bar, right? It can also occur with less efficient techniques like the ones I described back here, or for other reasons as well. So with less efficient technique, back movement often does occur, but with good technique, back movement can occur for either of those reasons, insufficient back strength or insufficient hip strength. And for further reading on that, you can check out one of my blog posts from a long time ago as well. Now, the upshot of that is that people with proportionally longer torsos or shorter arms have to bend over further to reach the bar in an effective place to deadlift from. And so they're just disadvantaged by virtue of their build, right? I've already begun explaining why your knees can't just shove forward to meaningfully help you in the deadlift. So you can't just shift load from your hips to your quads. You can't move yourself into a more upright torso position effectively. If your hips aren't strong enough to lift the weight, all you can do is start to round the back to get the bar moving. The only way you can get your quads involved in a deadlift is to move into a sumo position. So here's a sumo deadlift in the bottom position, right? And here's a conventional deadlift. You can see a more upright spine, so that reduces spinal flexion moment or extensor demands a little bit. So that can be very advantageous for people, particularly with the longer torsos. And at first glance, it probably looks like your hips do less work in this position as they're closer to the bar than they would be in the conventional deadlift. But in reality, this isn't the case. In reality, flexion and extension of the hip actually occurs in the plane of the femur. And the best way, and not in the plane of the torso, the best way to wrap your head around that is to think about a front double bicep. So if I give you guys a front double bicep now, and it's a shame that my camera's not got a much wider lens, look at these puppies. If I do a front double bicep, right, I'm still flexing my elbow, right? I'm still flexing the bicep itself, even though I'm moving my arm in towards the midline of my body. So this isn't adduction. This is elbow flexion, even though I'm out here. Likewise, if I just throw my arm forward and again do another gargantuan bicep flexing motion, I'm flexing my elbow. It doesn't matter which plane I'm moving in here. The same thing is true of hip extension. And so in reality, when you do a sumo deadlift, hip extension demands are very similar to hip extension demands in the conventional deadlift, right? Sumo basically uses the hips just as much as the conventional. And the same thing is actually true of the squat. So most of you would intuit that when you widen your stance or point your toes out, you can squat in a more upright position, right? But you also intuit that doing so still taxes the hips. And a lot of people like to make fun of like bikini fitness chicks doing sumo squats in the Smith machine, but doing so is actually quite a viable way to train the glutes for exactly that reason, I should say, because you are moving the hip through flexion and extension. You're just doing so in a plane off to the sides instead of forward and backwards like you would normally think about it, right? Now, where the quads come into the sumo deadlift also relates to that a little bit. So even though from the side, we can see that your knees shouldn't be ahead of the bar unless your technique is quite poor in a sumo position. They create lateral forces exactly like the triceps do in the bench, which increases the moment arm about the knee and allows them to actually do meaningful work. So in short, if you move from a conventional deadlift to a sumo deadlift position, you should require similar hip strength to successfully complete the pull, but it should reduce spinal extension demands a little bit and allow you to get your quads involved just a little bit more. Now, what that doesn't unfortunately mean is that you can just predictably look at people and immediately say that they should pull sumo. In practice, it's a little bit more complicated than that because although your build certainly plays a part, the way in which your hips are oriented, your relative strengths and weaknesses and things like that do play an important role as well. And so if somebody looks very uncomfortable in a conventional position, it's probably advisable to give them a go in sumo and see if you can coach them into doing that comfortably. But without trying both, you can't necessarily know for certain which is going to suit them best. Either way, though, you look uncomfortable in conventional, particularly if you have a longer torso and shorter arms, then perhaps sumo is going to be just a little bit better for you, at least as a starting point. Now, what we can do is bring all of the concepts we've spoken about today together and compare two lifts, right? So here's a squat and a conventional deadlift in figure 19 on the left here. And what I want you to do is imagine a given weight. Say it's 200 kilograms. Which of the two lifts here has a greater knee flexion moment, so will require more quad strength? Which has less of a hip flexor moment, so which should be taxing the hips a little bit less? A lesser back flexor moment, so it'd be taxing the back less. And if you think through that whole example, then you should probably, pause me if you need to, you should probably identify the squat. What you might actually say in the case of the hip flexor is that the squat's got a really closed hip angle here, but by the time they get to the same knee angle as the deadlift, it's certainly going to be less so. But either way, the squat should tax the quads more, the hips a little bit less, and the back a little bit less than the deadlift does. And those same principles of lift comparison can actually be applied to assessing any lift or comparing two similar accessory movements or variations on the main lift. So if you have a client and you're trying to deliberately target one muscle or one aspect of a movement, or minimize load put through a certain muscle, joint, or aspect of a movement, then by doing a similar comparison and identifying, which muscles are likely or which joints are going to be subjected to higher torques is a really, really good way of narrowing down your lift selection to get the one that best suits you. So guys, that brings me to the end of today's lecture. I'm going to just quickly recap the goals. By now, you should understand basic biomechanical principles, so things like force, torque, or moment, and moment arms, and also be able to relate them to lifting weights. You should then be able to identify the major joint torques in the power lifts and deduce which muscles are going to contribute to successful movement. And then we spoke about a few errors of lifting execution and how they relate to the force-producing demands of the lifts. So remember, we spoke about good morning squats and spoke about how they might arise as a result of insufficient quad strength. I spoke briefly about bar path in the bench press and showed you how shoulder flexion demands don't reduce sufficiently if you press straight up and not back to the shoulder. And then in the case of the deadlift, I spoke about how rounding the back can reduce hip extension demands a little bit, right? So we can relate the errors of lifting execution that we see to some of the force-producing demands of the lifts, and then we can infer which muscles or joints will be more or less taxed as a result of them. I hope you've really enjoyed today's lecture, guys. I know it can be quite dense of a topic. If you want to reach out to me for any help with things I've said, or to ask further questions, or just ask for other resources, you can get in contact with me on social media at w.berkmanpt. You can also email me at will@willberkman.com. I also have a podcast, Weekly Weights, so spelt weak, the antithesis of strong, Lee Weights, which you can listen to. And if you shoot either myself or my co-host Alex, who's going to do a lecture for this exact same course, if you shoot either of us a question or a message, then very often we'll address them on the podcast as well. So thank you, guys. Good luck with the assessment questions. I hope you've enjoyed it. Get in touch with me if there's anything I can do to help you out. Otherwise, goodbye and good luck.